Hi, this is Eric Swanson, and this is the lecture I would have been giving on November 13th, 2015 at the VSA convention in Baltimore, Maryland, had everything worked out the way it was supposed to work out. I'm recording this here at the shop. Here is a teleprompter program on my computer screen, so if you see my eyes looking around, I'm reading the teleprompter because I can't remember all of this. It's a long lecture. Also, there may be some cuts as I pause the camera and then start up again, so don't freak out. Anyway, let's get started here. The idea behind this lecture is to go over techniques for evaluating bows for repair, as well as purchase and resale from a technical standpoint, while better understanding some of the functional attributes a bow must have in order to satisfy the needs of musicians and customers. I'll also offer some of my opinions on the larger issues facing bow makers, dealers, and players in the 21st century. The scope of this lecture will be by necessity broad in order to appeal to the wide range of professional experiences and variation in knowledge of the VSA audience. I only have so much time available, so I'll limit my remarks to a few important concepts, but please know that this is a complex topic. With more time, we could go much deeper and into even greater detail. My approach emphasizes soundness of construction along with evaluation of playability by actually playing the bow. I hope that these ideas contained in this lecture will help you better select solid, great playing sticks for resale, as well as provide you with tools to educate musicians and sell good bows. For makers, maybe some of these ideas will inspire you to work more closely with accomplished musicians to make even better playing sticks. My technique is not rocket science. Rather, it's a system based strictly on common sense and a desire to understand what a good bow actually is from a functional and technical standpoint. It's an entirely practical approach, which I hope will help both musicians and VSA members. After years in the trenches doing endless amounts of bow rehairs, having seen and held thousands upon thousands of bows, as well as making a few when I had time, I decided at last to try and acquire some inventory. This was a big step for me, as I had intentionally turned my back on the world of dealing and concentrated exclusively on improving my abilities as a craftsman and on building my clientele. As a local bow guy in such a large market doing work for both professional musicians and many of the local shops, I had plenty of exposure to the wild world of violin dealing, and I didn't particularly like what I saw. Customers would bring me bows they were considering for purchase or show me bows they had just bought. I really wasn't selling or taking commissions at that time, so I was in a good position to offer them a straightforward evaluation. This mainly manifested itself in doing condition reports. While some musicians had purchased perfectly sound bows for reasonable prices, many showed me bows that had serious issues that negatively affected playability and value. Sometimes the bow had undisclosed damage or hidden lead, for example. Some of these issues could be addressed with a repair, camber work, straightening, or balance adjustment, but too often the bows were just not suitable for usage. The pricing was frequently problematic, although let me emphasize that there were numerous examples of very fairly priced bows. I usually decline to comment on attribution unless I came across a particularly egregious example. Let's face it, many certificates aren't worth the paper they're written on. It became clear to me that many shops were just not taking bows seriously enough, not taking their time in assessing and preparing their bows for sale, as well as playing fast and loose with pricing. Three main questions arose in my mind due to these experiences as I prepared to head off to my first auction. One, why were bows like these being offered by dealers in the first place? Two, why were musicians buying them? And three, just what constitutes a good bow? I really didn't know what to expect at the auction house. But what I found in regards to bows was interesting. The tables where the bows were laid out were crowded with middle-aged men sitting, staring intently at bow after bow. When they'd finished looking at one group of bows, they'd get up, shift over to the next chair, and silently scrutinize the next batch. I soon joined this throng, as I understood that each stick required careful examination. However, I noticed that few people double-checked the weights, and no one checked the balance point. I've only seen one exception to this. Also, most surprisingly, nobody was playing the bows. I'm a terrible violinist, but luckily my wife is an amazing musician who performs mainly with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. As I found bows that passed my physical examination, I would hand them off to her to check for playability. What I learned was quite humbling. Many of the sticks I'd selected out for technical correctness just played terribly. I mean, I didn't strike out completely, but my success rate at choosing great playing sticks based solely on technical characteristics was, let's just say, a bit humbling. The other issue was that my wife, despite her extensive training and years of professional experience at the highest levels of her field, was unsure of how to test a bow. It was time to rework our assessment methods. I needed to refine my methods of bow examination, and my wife needed to develop a better method of systematically testing for playability. Auction houses are increasingly reaching out to musicians, although they've traditionally been a resource for experts, dealers, and collectors due to their buyer beware nature. Now it's more common to hear musicians playing instruments and bows at auction, especially at auction houses like Tarisio. However, as we watched bows that had been rejected as being technically and functionally undesirable sell for large amounts of money, it became clear to us that either the dealers, and sometimes the musicians, buying these items had no idea what they're doing, or, more likely, just were not concerned enough with issues of playability, preferring to bid on and buy bows based mainly on attribution. In most professional fields, there are prominent beliefs and attitudes, some based in reality, others in tradition, which are generally created by elites and supported by rank-and-file members of the trade, who are so thoroughly invested in the system they serve or work in that they're unable to reflect upon or critique its most fundamental assumptions. Oftentimes, the dominant ideologies hide or obscure realities that we may not wish to face or we don't believe are important. While there may be a veneer of rational discourse, questioning fundamental beliefs or practices is socially taboo. In a field, or in any field, there's a hierarchy, sometimes clearly structured like the military or corporation, other times less defined but more historically or culturally understood. People in hierarchies or any business exhibit behavioral patterns. Most of those lower on the totem pole, so to speak, follow the beliefs and morals of the elites because they identify with and seek to emulate them. Yes, it may be acceptable to challenge or test certain technical ideas, but usually not underlying larger concepts. These prevailing cultural norms or commonly held beliefs are in fact artificial constructs rather than some kind of natural law. By investigating what lies at the root of these accepted beliefs, we may discover new approaches and a new vocabulary. It is essential, however, to fairly judge dominant concepts in an effort to separate out the solid, hard-won wisdom of our predecessors from their prejudices. There's always so much to learn. By the same token, new ideas must be treated with healthy skepticism. Many times the future is built by capitalizing on the best work of the past while simultaneously rejecting or throwing off outdated and limiting constructs. What are the dominant and most accepted beliefs in the violin field here in the United States regarding bows? With dealers, there's an obsession with attribution and identification. Bows are primarily valued for who made them, where they were made, and when they were made. French bows are the best, German bows the worst, with English bows somewhere in between. This approach has a number of interesting effects. It has made us, in many aspects, obsessed with history and geography. At most VSA or Federation meetings, there will be a myriad of historical lectures pointing out what house Tort lived in, which church Stradivari was married in, whose cousin married so-and-so's daughter, etc. It's also turned us into object scrutinizers. The best, most expensive books on the subject of bows are predominantly compendiums of photographs and measurements, along with some biographical information. We all have attended lectures speaking to the technical aspects of certain makers' work with an eye on identification. We obsess over details like chamfer knife chatter marks, pin placement, button proportions, brand lettering, nipple and mortise length, etc., etc. You'll notice that one crucial aspect of these bows is generally omitted in such publications, and that is their playing characteristics. So we sort bows into different piles based on commonly accepted industry standards. Old French bows made by makers who are perceived to be historically important are the most valuable. Gold-mounted bows with ivory or tortoiseshell frogs and buttons are better than gold and ebony-mounted sticks, which in turn are superior to ebony and silver-mounted bows, which of course are far superior to nickel-mounted examples. A bow that is in better condition, as close to mint as possible, is better than a well-played stick with handle and frogware. Certain makers are more valuable than others. The ranking decided mainly by dealers and collectors rather than musicians, at this point in time at least. There's been a tremendous amount of research and effort put into the studying the historical and technical aspects of bows. The wealth of knowledge is immense, and I, for one, am grateful for all the hard work by dedicated colleagues in the field. But it's important to point out that knowledge is not wisdom. Knowledge is simply information. It can be used to justify certain market approaches. It can be used to delude ourselves. It can be used to dominate and control our customers. We overemphasize authority. Remember that an authority is essentially self-created in this field. It's not a matter of academic degrees or professional certification, after all. And most of the time, if someone says they're knowledgeable about something in a convincing way, we tend to believe them. Don't get me wrong. Without doubt, there are real authorities in our field. I'm just saying that the violin business is largely unregulated, and we place too much emphasis on issues related to sales, which can lead to problems like an addiction to certificates. There's nothing like the Bar Association or the American Medical Association that really governs professional behavior and ethics. Yes, one can become a certified appraiser. There are 8 listed in the U.S. on the Appraisers Association of America website. or join the American Federation of Violin and Bow Makers, which is really more like a club than an active governing body. Here I need to say that I make a distinction between expertise and authority. There's a tremendous amount of expertise in the bow business. And here I mean the experience of craftsmen and women who work on bows day in and day out. These dedicated experts have so much knowledge about bows, but how much do we really care about them? The true leaders of the field are those who create the culture and rules of our trade, who we imbue with unassailable knowledge, pay the most attention to, and who weigh in on identification and attribution. Here musicians, as much as members of the trade, are to blame. Shops are judged not by the quality of the work and service they offer, but by the price and status of the items they sell. The more expensive a bow is, the better it is. This concept is the true philosophic root of the violin dealing business at present. What is the dominant ideology on the craft side of the business? The emphasis is on cleanliness of construction and originality of modeling. The accepted wisdom is that a bow following the right recipe by a competent craftsman will be a good bow. Bows are not tested by musicians at Violin Society of America competitions, only by experts and other makers. It's essentially a beauty contest. Yet a bow maker who has won many VSA awards is commonly regarded as a great maker. Now, without a doubt, these winners represent some of our most accomplished craftsmen. However, we're told that the bows are tested for playability, but they're just not played. Form trumps function, it seems. The culture of American bow making is definitely influenced by this competition and its rules. Makers eager to win analyze the styles and style predilections of the announced judges. Frogs and buttons fit so firmly and perfectly that they are sometimes difficult to work. Unique modeling becomes a way to stand out, etc., etc. Is the bow simply an accessory, or is it the music-making tool that defines and makes unique the family of bowed string instruments? The Oberlin Bowmaking Program, celebrating its 20th year, introduced American makers to the historic French style of bowmaking, advancing a very young field that was mainly defined by what we may call the Salco School, who was initially trained in France but really worked in his own style in New York. However, the paid participation of master French bowmakers working solidly in the Mirecourt tradition ceased over a decade ago. And the program is currently a gathering of invite-only makers who work on their own and together, focusing mainly on technical construction techniques, as well as socializing with colleagues, and the creation and enforcement of social hierarchies. There's a lot to learn from the Oberlin Bowmaking Program, without a doubt, and American-made bows are better made, better looking, with the exception of some rather unique modeling than they ever have been. Unlike many of the older European workshop systems where groups of makers made massive amounts of bows under a master, American makers are creating their own bows by themselves from scratch and are working at the highest levels of craftsmanship. However, there's not enough official conversation concerning issues of function. There's undoubtedly a tremendous wealth of functional knowledge out there. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm simply saying the emphasis is firmly on form. The belief being that fine form will equal fine function, as reflected in and influenced by the VSA competition. Financially, bowmakers suffer unless they have the ability to sell large quantities of bows directly to musicians, which is rare. When they consign their bows, some dealers will take as much as 50% of retail. And when shop owners do sell a bow, it can sometimes be hard for bowmakers to get paid. The emphasis on appearances over questions of playability by bowmakers and the VSA competition, as well as the lack of economic support by many dealers, come together to define the ideology of the bow-making business today. The modern bow, as we know it, is the result of a close collaboration of musician and maker. Think of the Kramer model bow, for example. Neither party, despite being masters of their art, could have invented such a thing on their own. If we accept the story of Viotti and the Tort brothers, for example, we must also accept the crucial interplay of form and function. Viotti, as well as other musicians and composers of the time, needed something new, a bow that better handled the music and developing technique of the time. The Tort brothers were located in one of Europe's most important musical centers and were highly skilled and successful craftsmen. A great bow is something that may be crafted by a maker, but it must satisfy the player. No less an expert than Bernard Millant has commented that the bow would have never evolved into its present state without the demands and needs of musicians and composers. A bow is very different from a violin. With an existing instrument, there are many more variables that can come into play when trying to adjust or improve playability. Neck length and angle, bass bar, fingerboard, bridge, post, strings, after length, etc., etc. Some people have attempted to regraduate older bows, but it's less common to see that. A bow is simpler, more elegant, but in many ways more mysterious as a music-making device. There are few adjustments to be made outside of straightening, cambering, rehairing, and changing balance. In many ways, you're stuck with what you get, so it's important to be more cautious when evaluating a bow for purchase. A bow is also easier to fake than a violin for many of the same reasons. The very first thing I do is weigh the bow. Here, a good scale is needed. A small portable version is best for travel, like the Japanese-made Tanita I generally use. At the shop, a larger digital scale or a nice triple beam will do the job. Most auction houses will have the weights listed, but I always double check because I often find errors. Many of us know the accepted range of bow weights as being 58 to 62 grams for a violin bow, 68 to 72 for a viola bow, and 78 to 82 for cello bows. In my experience, these weight ranges are a bit too narrow. The fact is that there are lighter bows and heavier bows that work amazingly well, and there are professionals at the highest levels using these sticks. The concern over an overly light bow is that it won't sit in the string, pull out enough sound, and will feel like it wants to fly away. A bow that is too heavy can dampen the sound, feel unwieldy, and can tire and eventually injure a player. The range of acceptable weights needs to be expanded several grams in both directions. So a violin bow, for example, can weigh 56 to 64 grams. But always keep an eye out for lighter and heavier bows that just break all the rules. It's important to note here that there's no single perfect type of bow. There's a wide range of preferences and musical applications. Some musicians may prefer a stick that has a more downward motion, that sticks to the string and needs to be coerced into spiccato type strokes, while others prefer a livelier bow with plenty of upward motion, but may be less willing to just sit in the string. A stick that works great for X may not work well with Y. So weight doesn't exist in a bubble. It must always be considered in conjunction with balance. A bow that is above or below the commonly accepted weight levels may still be balanced and play well. If a bow has a good balance, there's a better chance it will feel natural in the hand. A bow that is significantly out of balance, however, even if it's exactly, say, 60 grams, may feel deceptively heavy or light depending on the weight distribution. If a bow is too light in the tip, it may feel like it won't stay on the string, where a bow that is more heavy in the tip may feel better for some players, especially younger ones, but can feel ungainly in the hand and feel like it wants to flip forward when at the frog. There are a number of ways to judge balance point. It doesn't matter in my mind which method or measurements you use. The main factor is that you take the concept of balance into consideration. I balanced a bow on my finger and measure in inches with a steel ruler to the end of the wood where the button meets the stick. In a violin and viola bow, I look for a measurement of about 9.5 inches, and in a cello bow, about 9 inches. If a bow is rather light, I'd prefer to see it slightly tip-heavy. Just remember that the closer your finger is to the end of the stick, the more frog-heavy it is. The closer to the head, the more tip-heavy. You may notice that I say about 9.5 inches or around 9 inches. This is because balancing or measuring balance in this way is less than scientific. I've done tests and feel there's about a 3 millimeter plus or minus error here. However, I find this method more than suffices from a practical perspective. There are also bows that are technically out of balance, but musicians love. Ultimately, the player will decide what works, and we need to respect that, but always continue to educate our clients. An important consideration of checking both weight and balance when evaluating bows is the issue of available adjustment. If I find a bow that is 54 grams and light in the tip, how am I going to correct for that? Traditionally, you would remove weight from the handle, but this would make the entire bow even lighter. A heavy silver head plate will move the balance, but only a little bit. You could use a lead plug in the tip mortise or add weight inside, but these are desperate measures I might only do for a customer in need. I'd never buy or sell such a bow. The other problem is the heavy bow that is significantly tip-heavy. In the case of a very tip-heavy bow, the remedy would be to add a heavier grip and wrap, bringing the bow into balance. The problem here being that you may end up with a stick that is entirely too heavy. I've seen many of these types of bows at auction sell for decent amounts of money. It's my advice to avoid them entirely. There's a reason they've ended up at the auction, and it's not because they are amazing examples, no matter what they may be branded. After a consideration of weight and balance, I examine the health of the stick. Damage in the handle can usually be repaired responsibly and not affect overall value too much. So I tend not to worry over a crack or large holes in the butt end. However, it's important to emphasize the it's important to examine the handle and handle mortise for previous repairs, alterations, or grafts. A colleague once bought a bow at auction only to find out that the area directly forward of the mortise, the frog mortise and pilot hole, had been drilled out and packed with lead. In another case, I found a Frechner with a graft in the handle. Examine the head for any cheek cracks, splines, blown out and repaired mortises, as well as damaged or replaced tip wood. One must be careful because Pernambuco can have pronounced grain lines that may confuse you. Take a close look at the head chamfers for cracks, as it's harder to disguise them on these flat surfaces. Has the head been altered in any way, perhaps to look like a certain maker or model? Look for recent suspicious tool marks or over-polished and touched-up areas. The length of the stick must be examined for any lifts, checks, cracks, grafts, as well as any burn marks from bad straightening or camber work. You can use the naked eye, cheap reading glasses, or even a magnifying glass. Check the stick for straightness and camber. Most crooked bows can be straightened quite easily unless they're made that way. Any kinks in the camber can usually be corrected as well. I also always check for twist. I've been told by some dealers at auctions that they always reject a bow with any twisting, but I have been largely successful in removing it, except in cases where the bow was just not made properly in the first place. There are two main ways of checking for twist. First, you can put the bow on a relatively level surface, making sure the frog is securely fit to the stick with no wobbling, and hold the frog down flat on the table. Next, look at the head of the bow and see if it too is sitting flat on the surface. The other method involves holding the stick in such a manner that you can look down directly above the frog, centering the stick, the wood of the stick, on the metal of the ferrule. Keep both eyes open as you do this. Holding the bow steady, look up at the head. You'll see whether the stick is twisted to one side or the other. Keep in mind here that a small twist is not necessarily a problem, and that a twist into the playing side of the bow is preferable to a twist in the opposite direction. Also, a twist doesn't necessarily mean that there is a playing issue. If the bow is slightly twisted but it plays fine, leave it alone. Next, I take a look at the frog and button. The first thing to consider is whether the frog fits the stick properly. Do the facets match, and do the sides of the frog stick out from the handle? Is the button too large or small or out of character with the overall style of the bow? Are they original to the stick? Check the frog for signs of repair, like a cheval or any kind of wood fill. Is the thumb projection exceedingly worn? Make sure the ferrule is healthy, although ferrules can be repaired or replaced without any damage to the value or function of the bow. Worn out pearl eyes or slides are not an issue except for the extra work that you'll have to do in order to get the bow ready for sale. Some players and dealers are turned off by signs of wear caused by years and years of playing. Oftentimes you'll see a bow with dents in the top of the handle where the thumb projection meets the stick, or on top of the stick in the wrap area. Some of the bigger areas of wear can be filled if necessary, and a handle can be covered in leather or tape to protect from further damage. It's important to consider why a bow would have so much wear. Yes, different people have different body chemistry or may have sweaty hands, but such wear usually means that the bow has good playing characteristics. Otherwise, why would it have such damage? I really like these player sticks and have found that the majority of them play very well. Bows with heavy wear may be devalued financially, but can be responsibly repaired and represent a great deal for players who just need a bow that works well as a music-making tool. All right, now let's go over some of the tools I use when evaluating bows in the shop and out. I've created an area in my shop which I call my bow lab in order to better examine and study bows that come through the shop. It consists of, first of all, a Zeiss surgical microscope. I use this for examining bows in great detail. This is the same type of microscope that John Becker here in this building on the 10th floor uses for filling and touching up cracks, etc., although it's not the identical year and model. His is a little nicer. Nice features of this tool are the ranges of magnification from 5 times to 40 times, and that it's illuminated through the actual objective. This is great for seeing cracks, lifts, grafts, etc. I bought mine used on Craigslist for around $500, although you can pay a lot more. Next, also, I have a USB microscope. This is a $30 illuminated mini microscope that attaches to your computer to a USB connection. The magnified images appear on your monitor where you can capture images and save them. I also use this tool to better show customers damage that they'd otherwise have difficulty seeing clearly with the naked eye. I can also email the photos to colleagues or customers, which is a convenient factor. I also have a blacklight box. I once had the idea of constructing a box that was completely black inside with the viewport and a cloth covered opening so I could check bows over with blacklight without shutting off all the lights in the shop or having to go into another room. Customers would also be capable or able to easily take a look. I found this box on eBay. It's apparently designed for checking gemstones. It has 2 blacklight bulbs, each with a different wavelength. The glass viewing window is made of protective glass to protect the eyes, which is important when dealing with blacklight. As I mentioned before, I have a good digital scale. I have an O-house with a large display so customers can see easily if they want. I also have a triple beam. I like the O-house dialogram for double checking weights and also for weighing heavier objects. I use a handheld LED ultraviolet light at auctions often. This is a Streamlight Nightcom UV LED combo that's useful. You can switch between the UV and the LED. It has 2 levels of light in each setting, and it's really good for checking out cracks. Also, there's a funny little UV light magnifier for your phone camera. It's only a $5 clip-on magnifier with both LED and UV lighting. It's not the highest quality item, but it actually works well for travel and for checking out cracks. I also have a Luxo magnifier lamp. There's several models of these. I really like the Luxo Wave magnifier that has dual fluorescent lights, and this one has a 3.5 times magnification and a nice big wide magnifier lens. Another cool thing to get is better lenses for your iPhone camera. If you don't have a fancy camera setup but have a phone with a decent camera in it, these clip-on lenses, specifically the macro lens, can be quite useful. You can take a picture for quick reference or also use it like a digital magnifying lens. Also, I have a surgical lamp. This is also similar to a machinist lamp. In addition to my normal bench lamps, I have this high-powered lamp with superior color rendition that's really good for checking out bows. So far, I've spoken about the violin business and technical considerations concerning selecting a bow. Now it's time to turn to the musicians. In my introduction, I asked two questions which pertain to musicians and bows. The first was, why are musicians sometimes buying bows which clearly don't work, and what exactly is a good bow? So, why are musicians buying bows that are too heavy, out of balance, overpriced, too stiff, crooked, and just hard to use? Three answers. The state of education, technical and practical, marketing, and concepts of tone. String musicians spend years mastering their instruments. The predominant pedagoggical theories promote endless practicing and repetition alongside constant learning of new repertoire. The string instrument is so difficult to play at a high level that players who didn't start when they were little kids are considered to be at a serious disadvantage. So players are so focused on learning technique and practicing that they don't get an opportunity to learn very much about the instruments and bows they use every day. This lack of learning is why many students and players depend so heavily on teachers and colleagues to help them select a bow or violin, even into adulthood. The fact is that there is very little discussion in the average conservatory about what constitutes a good violin or a good bow, much less about the ins and outs of the violin business. Because there's a serious lack of education for musicians on the equipment front, they fall prey to marketing and the dominant ideology of the fiddle selling business. Old French bows are best. The more expensive the bow, the better it is. Some names have a higher cachet than others and are therefore more desirable. So some musicians fall into the status trap where they are judged or feel they are judged by the pedigree of their bow and instrument. So in the absence of the consideration of the attributes a good bow must have, and in the face of heavy cultural emphasis on attribution in violin shops, musicians often fall back on something they do know about, which is tone. They may ignore a bow that has serious functional flaws, costs a fortune, doesn't come with respectable papers, if they feel it sounds good on their instrument. I've seen many musicians select bows that had horrible draws and weak spiccato, were way out of balance, and had questionable attributions and prices, all in the name of tone. So what are the attributes of a good bow? The first thing to think about is the quality of the draw. By putting the bow on the string at the frog, and here I mean right where the hair comes out of the ferrule, and pulling it over the string all the way to the tip and back, one can tell so much about the quality of the stick. Here I usually recommend using the A or D string on a violin, because the G is a little larger and more resistant, and the E string is narrow and bright sounding. Also, it's best to play the bow halfway between the bridge and the end of the fingerboard, because this is a common contact point and shows the bow's ability best. One can play the open string or scale for testing purposes. So first, how does the bow track across the string? Is there a jiggle in the middle of the stick? Most bows have some kind of vibration, but is the jiggle strong enough to affect tracking? Or does it cause the player to feel a momentary loss of control so that she overcompensates or potentially crushes the sound? A jiggle can be distracting or annoying, which is something you certainly don't want if you're playing difficult repertoire. If the bow visibly moves during the draw, but the musician can't feel the jiggle, it's just fine. Next, does the bow collapse at any point along its length? This is when the bow seems to lose resistance and slumps downward, trapping the hair between the string and the stick. Some bows may touch the hair from time to time, but remain resilient in the hand and cause no control or tone issues. But a bow that just gives out can be disconcerting for the player. Does the bow want to slide away or go off track? A great stick, when played with proper technique, will feel like a train solidly connected to the rails as it moves down the track. The bow only shifts position back and forward between the bridge and the end of the fingerboard when the musician moves it to attain certain tonal effects. Think about balance as well. Does the bow feel connected to the string along its entire length? Does it get into the string properly? Or does it feel like it wants to lose contact, causing you to feel the need to press harder? Some bows feel extraordinarily uncomfortable at the tip or frog, especially in the hand. As the player executes a complete and full up bow, the elbow rises, the arm lifts from the shoulder, and the hand moves toward the musician's face. Can you feel the hand cramping as this complex movement is executed? Amazing bows feel like approaching the frog is like drawing something comfortably in, as in a hug. As the bow moves down, drawing towards the tip away from the frog, the hand and the arm drops away from the instrument, moving from the shoulder, before the forearm begins to drop back from the elbow. At this point, the player releases the hand slightly. The nature of some bows is such that as the player draws down past the middle point, the bow creates a sensation of stress and tension in the bow hand, which increases as the bow reaches the tip. The next major thing a bow must do is bounce. Some bows feel like they want to move down into the string, which can be a great attribute, but may be reluctant to jump, while other sticks are more lively, having a tendency towards a more upward motion. Here, the potential problem being a sense that the bow is out of control. There's no right or wrong. Great sticks and players' preferences fall across the spectrum. However, a bow must be capable of performing certain strokes. Jumping strokes where the bow leaves the string and returns, especially the different types of spiccato, are amongst the most difficult techniques a musician must master. This isn't a case where great musicians can make any bow work. Some sticks just don't do the job, and players won't even try to make them work. They'll simply just set them aside. Students saddled with bows that are not capable of good movement will struggle and perhaps fail to develop a sophisticated spiccato. Though there's much to be said about properly developed bow technique or bowing technique, when we're testing bows to be added to our inventory, they must pass muster with the Mendelssohn or Schumann Scherzo, Beethoven's Eroica or Prokofiev's Classical Symphony. In testing, most bows don't pass these tests. Bows and their failings can be weak, without bounce, or lack more complex tone. Many customers come in struggling with themselves, only to find that a profoundly functional bow can eliminate difficult technical issues. Many of these pieces consist of difficult string crossings and spiccato strokes. While it may be easy to do spiccato on the E string, getting a good spiccato on the G string is much more challenging. Regarding crossings, can the bow manage the shifting between different size strings, where the different notes need to speak immediately? Adding to this, many musicians are not really sure of the motion of spiccato or how it's really generated physiologically. So, very basically, spiccato is a motion or stroke where the bow hair comes into contact with the string and then comes off the string, becoming airborne, but remains extremely close to the string. There's certainly a range of spiccato strokes, but one of the most difficult is what we call the orchestral spiccato. We've found that if a bow can comfortably manage this stroke, it usually will excel at most other forms of leaping or jumping strokes where the hair leaves the string. Here we're talking about a very small, tight movement of the hair off and onto the string at piano or mezzo piano levels. Despite it being a small, fast, tiny stroke, when the hair is in contact with the string, the contact is surprisingly concrete. It's not a brush stroke. Anyway, by way of concluding this talk, I'd like to make several suggestions that I believe would vastly improve the lot of bow makers, musicians, and dealers. First of all, to makers and shop owners, consider issues of playability more when evaluating new bows or bows you'll stock in inventory. Educate your customers and clients, and in turn learn from them. Many musicians could use some guidance, and many makers and dealers have much to benefit from listening to the players they serve. Never cease to educate yourself. In connection to this, the VSA needs to add musicians into the mix when judging bows. I've been told this has been tried before and has failed. I can find no logical reason which explains why judging a bow is any harder than judging a violin. Qualitative judging is always fraught with difficulty, and competitions are by definition compromises. There are just so many variables involved. If we believe that the modern bow is a result of not only the musical and social changes in the late 18th century Europe, but also of the essential collaboration between players and makers, then it only makes sense to find a sensible way of involving musicians in the VSA bow judging process. What would your reaction be to the concept of removing musicians from the judging of the violins, or violas, or cellos, or basses at the VSA competition? It would seem odd, right? Well, no bowmaker can receive the equivalent of a tone award, which is ridiculous, because I see expensive classic bows every day which would never have won a VSA medal, even one new, that just play beautifully and sound wonderful. You can't have something like, say, a playability award without the participation of musicians. When the player judges play and talk about winning instruments, and the audience asks questions, the winning bows sit there rather anonymously, without recognition or comment. Is this what we want for bows and bow makers? A kind of second-class citizenship? Of course not. I freely offer my assistance if the VSA would like to explore how to effectively incorporate musicians into the bow judging process. Turning to Oberlin. The Oberlin workshops, although sponsored by the VSA and run by many VSA board members, in fact has nothing to do with the VSA. It's actually run through Oberlin College. Because of this, it's unclear how it's organized or structured. There seems to be no formal way of making suggestions, submitting workshop proposals, or critiques or concerns, for that matter. It's unclear who's getting paid to participate, and if so, how much. The program clearly generates plenty of money through its tuition, perhaps as much as $200,000 a summer if the listed online tuition and attendance rates are correct. I'm afraid that these valuable workshops are simply run by a core group of insiders with very little oversight or outside participation. While this system has clearly worked for some of the programs, others could use an injection of new ideas and energy. Regarding the Oberlin bow-making programs, I'd like to commend the work of Jerry Paswitz and Rodney Moore and their repair and restoration workshop. This amazing workshop is open to those who are interested, easy to sign up for, and extremely helpful and flexible. I would recommend it to anyone without hesitation, and in fact I have many times. The bow-making program is a historic workshop which has had an incredibly positive effect on our craft, but it needs to continue to evolve and expand to stay relevant. First off, it's not clear how to sign up or what the requirements are for inclusion. There are no details about the program on the website and no information on who to contact. By making it clear what the program actually represents and giving interested makers a clear idea of who is eligible and how to sign up, there'll be more inclusivity rather than the sense of exclusivity the workshop currently has. This shouldn't be some kind of small secret society or fraternity open only to a select core of longtime attendees and their vetted guests. If you look at the violin making workshop by comparison, you'll find an incredible variety of ages, genders, cultures, languages, as well as greater overall numbers. New faces and personalities mean new energy and strengthen the workshop through different ideas, personal experiences, and perspectives. The workshop is currently is an amazing repository of technical knowledge and is comprised of some extraordinarily talented and experienced bow makers. Let's add to that. It'd be nice to have more curriculum as well. Wouldn't it be great to build on the program's strengths by adding more formal demonstrations and organized group discussions on topics germane to our field? Why not talk more about the business aspects of making as well? It's one thing to make a great bow and quite another to sell it. So I say open up the workshop, democratize it, and build upon its already impressive foundations. So this brings me to my final points. Perhaps it's time to add a new workshop at Oberlin. I propose a kind of sister workshop to the violin acoustics program, one where makers, experts, and players can work together on practical issues of bow function. This could be a place where we can consider the issues of playability, working on the deeper issue of understanding what makes a good bow. Here I emphasize the inclusion of working musicians in order to foster a better connection between maker and player, creating a dialogue of mutual education, drawing together our often disparate experiences, training and knowledge in order to move forward and better ourselves and our inextricably linked professions. For me, the way forward for makers, players, and shop owners is a renewed consideration and appreciation for concepts of fine function in conjunction with historical research and issues of craftsmanship. We need to move away from the emphasis on and addiction to certification and all the potential problems and abuses inherent in a system which places pedigree and price over playability. I've even considered creating something like a certificate of playability for bows I sell in the shop. For example, this paper would include a full condition report listing weight, balance, repairs, materials, etc., as well as the description of the bow's functional attributes. Musicians shopping for a bow could use such a certificate as a guide to help them best select a suitable stick. Yes, consideration of origin and provenance is important and helpful, but we need a more holistic and self-conscious approach to evaluating bows. Sometimes I find that issues of provenance and pricing get in the way of me doing my job. Instead of being able to focus on the bow itself, I have to first consider whether the bow is authentic or not and what it should sell for. Musicians often bring me bows that they bought for large sums of money without any kind of documentation, which they'd like to consign. Oftentimes, these are bows that I would never have personally selected for sale. Here, the prevailing ideology becomes a machine which is difficult to override and ignore. The system forces me to become a history detective first and a bowmaker second. Considerations of music making and playability can easily be eclipsed. Musicians are as vital as bowmakers in the creation of music, and the knowledge base of both needs to be better integrated and shared, for we're part of a whole rather than separate forces. The bow is a vital music-making tool, one which defines the unique nature of the family of string instruments. An item which is complex in its simplicity, a highly personal extension of the musician herself, without which the violin would be practically mute. Give this voice the respect it deserves. Thank you very much.